There are places beneath the earth that were never meant to be found. Not caves carved by water over millennia. Not natural formations mapped by geologists. These were deliberate constructions, entire cities, some spanning hundreds of thousands of square feet, built in secret, at a frantic pace, by governments operating under the shadow of the most destructive war in human history. And when the war ended, many of those governments said very little about what they had built, why they had built it, and, perhaps most importantly, what had happened inside. Some of the structures have since been acknowledged. Tours are offered. Photographs are permitted. Officials will tell you, with a calm and practiced certainty, that these were simply wartime necessities. Bunkers, storage facilities, command posts, the kind of thing every nation builds when bombs are falling from the sky. And perhaps that explanation would be satisfying if not for the scale, if not for the secrecy, if not for the fact that, decades after the last shots were fired, certain corridors remain sealed. Certain records remain classified. Certain questions are still met with silence. To understand what was built beneath the ground, you first have to understand the world above it. By 1940, aerial bombardment had transformed the nature of warfare entirely. The German Luftwaffe had demonstrated, with devastating efficiency over Warsaw, Rotterdam, and London, that no city was safe. No government building, no factory, no communication hub could exist without the constant possibility of being reduced to rubble in a single night. The strategic logic was clear. If the machinery of government, of industry, of war production could be pushed underground, it could survive almost anything. Britain began its subterranean construction programs as early as 1938, before the war had officially begun. The Cabinet War Rooms, located beneath the Treasury Building in London, were operational by August of that year, a labyrinth of rooms where Winston Churchill and his inner circle would coordinate the entire British war effort through the worst of the Blitz. But the Cabinet War Rooms, now a museum, were only the most visible piece of something far larger. Germany, meanwhile, had been tunneling on an entirely different scale. Under the direction of Organisation Todt, the Nazi engineering corps responsible for the Autobahn, the Atlantic Wall, and a dozen other monumental projects, hundreds of thousands of forced laborers, most of them prisoners from occupied territories, were put to work carving out an empire beneath the European countryside. The Mittelwerk facility in the Harz Mountains of central Germany was one of the largest. Stretching for miles through converted gypsum mines, it was here that the V-2 rocket, the world's first long-range ballistic missile, was manufactured in secret, underground, out of reach of Allied bombers. By the time the war ended in 1945, an estimated 12,000 to 15,000 laborers had died in the Mittelwerk tunnels alone. The official records are incomplete. Some historians believe the true number was higher. What the official histories describe is, on the surface, comprehensible. Governments at war built underground facilities. They used forced labor. They manufactured weapons and housed leadership and stored supplies. All of this is documented to varying degrees. But the documentation has gaps. And the gaps, when you look closely, follow a peculiar pattern. Consider the Burlington facility in the English county of Wiltshire. Officially known as Site 3, and codenamed Burlington during its construction in the 1950s, though its roots trace back to wartime planning, this underground complex was designed to serve as an alternative seat of the British government in the event of nuclear war. It could house approximately 4,000 government officials and civil servants. It had its own BBC radio studio, its own water supply, its own hospital, its own railway system running through its tunnels. It covered 35 acres of subterranean space. The British government did not publicly acknowledge Burlington's existence until 2004. For roughly 50 years, this city beneath the Wiltshire Hills, fully equipped, periodically maintained, waiting, was officially a secret. When journalists and historians finally gained access, they found something that felt less like an emergency bunker and more like a parallel world. Streets, offices, a pub, row upon row of dormitories, a prime minister's suite. all of it preserved under fluorescent light, undisturbed, as if the emergency it had been built for was still, in some quiet official calculation, a possibility. The British government explained this in straightforward terms. It was a Cold War contingency, a relic of a frightened age, ultimately decommissioned and declassified. Which is a reasonable explanation, except that Burlington's design incorporated wartime lessons that went beyond the Blitz. The specific ventilation systems, the particular depth of the tunnels, the layout of its communication infrastructure, all of it reflected knowledge that could only have come from the wartime underground construction programs that preceded it. Programs whose full documentation has never been released. The wartime archives, when they can be accessed, are extraordinary documents. The British National Archives hold thousands of pages of correspondence between engineers, military planners, and government ministers dating from the late 1930s onward. But there are notable absences. Files that are referenced in other documents, cited, catalogued, mentioned in meeting minutes that have never been released, and in some cases have been officially described as lost. One such file, referenced in a 1944 Cabinet Office memorandum, appears to concern a network of tunnels beneath the English Channel coast that was distinct from the known Dover tunnel system. The memorandum refers to the project by a code name, Operation Pendant, and notes that it has been transferred to a separate classification authority. Historians who have requested pendant files have consistently been told they cannot be located. In Germany, the situation is even more complex. The post-war discovery of the Nazi underground network revealed a scale of construction that shocked even the Allied officers tasked with inspecting the sites. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, touring the Middlework facility in April 1945, reportedly described it as something that beggared description. His written account, published later, uses careful, measured language, but the photographs taken by military photographers that day show something that those words struggle to contain. Hall after hall of machinery, assembly lines for weapons of mass destruction, all of it buried beneath a mountain, all of it built by human hands under conditions that were, by any measure, catastrophic for those who labored there. The post-war West German government, in the process of reconstruction and the effort to establish a stable democratic identity, made certain decisions about what to preserve and what to bury figuratively and literally. Several of the major underground facilities were sealed. A few were demolished. Access to others was restricted for decades under provisions that cited ongoing security concerns, even after the Cold War had ended. A researcher named Rainer Karlsch, writing in the early 2000s, spent years examining German wartime records that had been held in Soviet archives and only became available after the reunification of Germany in 1990. What he found suggested that certain Nazi underground facilities had been used for experiments, weapons research of a nature that the post-war German state was, for understandable reasons, deeply reluctant to discuss in detail. His findings were controversial. Some were disputed. But the underlying documents, the actual archival records he cited, have never been fully explained away. If you look only at Britain or only at Germany or only at Japan, where the wartime government constructed an enormous underground command center beneath the hills of Matsushiro in Nagano Prefecture, using Korean forced laborers and consuming resources that the country could barely afford, you might conclude that each case is simply its own story, its own particular moment of wartime desperation. But when you look at all of them together, a pattern emerges that is harder to dismiss. Every major wartime power constructed underground facilities of a scale that exceeded what their publicly stated purposes required. Every one of those governments classified the relevant documentation at the highest available level. Every one of them, in the post-war years, engaged in a process of selective disclosure, releasing some information, acknowledging some facilities while maintaining silence about others. And in virtually every case, the silence has been most complete around the facilities where the largest number of people worked or died, or where the most significant research was conducted. The Matsushiro complex in Japan is a striking example. Construction began in November 1944 and continued until the final days of the war. An estimated 7,000 Korean laborers, working under conditions that survivors later described as extraordinarily harsh, excavated a network of tunnels stretching for more than 10 kilometers. The stated purpose was to relocate the Imperial General Headquarters underground, to allow the Japanese military command to continue operating through the anticipated Allied invasion. That much is acknowledged. What is less clearly documented is what else was intended for those tunnels. Accounts given by survivors in the decades after the war describe sections of the complex that were sealed off from the main labor force, areas that were accessible only to specific military and scientific personnel. When Japanese historians in the 1990s began examining wartime records related to Matsushiro, they encountered the familiar obstruction. Files that were cited in other documents but could not be located, sections of official records that had been redacted under provisions that technically expired years earlier but had not been reviewed. In 1972, a retired British civil engineer named Harold Wentworth gave a lengthy interview to a regional newspaper in southwest England. Wentworth had worked, he said, in a minor administrative capacity for a wartime construction project in Wiltshire, a project he described as far larger than anything that had been publicly acknowledged. He spoke of tunnel systems that connected multiple sites across a considerable distance. He mentioned a facility he called the Junction, which he described as a central hub from which several tunnel networks radiated outward. He said that by the time he left the project in late 1943, the junction was fully operational and staffed by personnel he was not permitted to identify. Wentworth's interview attracted little attention. The newspaper that published it was a small regional publication. No national outlet followed up. The interview exists today only because a local history society digitized the newspaper's archives in 2009. When researchers have attempted to cross-reference Wentworth's account against known wartime construction records, they have found partial corroborations, references to construction activity in the areas he described, requisitioning of materials consistent with his timeline, but no direct documentation of the junction itself. This is a recurring feature of the wartime underground story. Evidence that is suggestive rather than conclusive. Testimony that is specific enough to be credible but difficult to verify against records that are either classified, lost, or simply absent. A 1946 letter from a German engineer named Friedrich Altmann, held in a private collection and cited by a historian in a 1989 monograph, describes working on a facility near Nordhausen, adjacent to the Mittelwerk, that he says was used for a purpose he is reluctant to name directly, but which he characterizes as not being the manufacture of conventional weapons. The historian who cited the letter noted that she had been unable to locate any official documentation of the facility Altmann described. In Japan, the testimonies of Korean survivors of the Matsushiro construction were gathered by civil society organizations in the 1980s and 1990s. Several of those testimonies describe being forcibly relocated from one section of the tunnel network to another, in a manner that suggests the supervisors did not want the general labor force to see certain areas. One survivor, interviewed in Seoul in 1994 and identified only by his family name, described watching military vehicles unload large crates in a section of the tunnel he had previously helped excavate. He was told afterward that the section had been permanently sealed. He never worked in it again. None of this proves a conspiracy. That word is too simple and too dramatic for what the evidence actually suggests. What the evidence suggests is something more mundane and, in certain ways, more troubling. It suggests that the underground construction programs of World War II were larger, more complex, and more varied in their purposes than any government has fully disclosed. It suggests that the decisions about what to reveal and what to conceal were made not only for reasons of genuine national security, but also, and perhaps primarily, for reasons of political convenience. Because the full story of what was built and how and by whom and at what cost to human life is a story that no government has been entirely willing to tell. The forced labor question alone is significant. The use of concentration camp prisoners in the Mittelwerk and similar facilities was acknowledged at the Nuremberg trials, and several German officials were prosecuted for their roles. but the full accounting of which facilities used forced labor, under what conditions, and with what results has never been completed. Researchers working in German archives today still encounter documents that are withheld, files that are described as under review, requests that are acknowledged and then quietly not answered. In Britain, the Official Secrets Act has been used at various points to prevent the disclosure of wartime construction records that by any reasonable measure should have entered the public domain decades ago. The standard justification is national security, that even historical information about tunnel systems and underground facilities could, in theory, be useful to a hostile intelligence service. Most historians regard this justification with skepticism. But skepticism, in the face of an official classification order, does not open sealed files. And then there are the deeper questions. Questions about what was researched in those sealed sections of Matsushiro, and in the unnamed facility near Nordhausen, and in whatever it was that Harold Wentworth called the Junction. Questions about why certain wartime records were not simply classified, but apparently destroyed or lost in ways that make their absence impossible to confirm as accidental. Questions about the gap between the scale of what was built and the purposes that have been officially acknowledged, because in every case when you map the known facilities against the documented purposes, there is space left over. Underground rooms and tunnels and sealed chambers that the official record does not explain. Perhaps the explanation is ordinary. Perhaps governments, in the chaos of a global war, built more than they needed and more than they planned, and the excess was sealed away not because of secrets but because of bureaucratic inertia, because the will to document and disclose simply never materialized in the urgent, exhausted aftermath of the conflict. Perhaps the classified files are classified not because of what they contain, but because of what classifying them once required, and because no one has since been willing to do the administrative work of making them public. Perhaps Harold Wentworth misremembered. Perhaps Friedrich Altmann was embellishing. Perhaps the Korean survivor who watched the crates being unloaded in the sealed tunnel was seeing something entirely mundane that only looked significant in retrospect. Perhaps the patterns are not patterns at all, just the natural tendency of human minds to find meaning in coincidence, to connect dots that were never meant to be connected. Or perhaps something else is true. Perhaps the people who built these places and worked in these places and died in these places encountered something, knew something, witnessed something, that the governments of the post-war world decided, for reasons that made complete sense to them at the time, that the rest of us did not need to know. The tunnels are still there. Many of them remain sealed. The files or the absence of the files remain what they are. And underneath the official histories, underneath the carefully worded museum placards and the declassified documents and the government press releases, the underground cities of World War II continue to wait in the dark. Patient, silent, holding whatever it is they hold.